Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. Herbert Hoover is one of the worst presidents in American history. At least that's what most people think. He was the president during the Great Depression, when banks failed, businesses collapsed, and millions of Americans struggled just to survive. For many people, that's where his story begins and ends. Herbert Hoover was a failed president during America's worst economic crisis. That's all there is to know, right? Well, what if I told you that that's not the whole story? What if 4 difficult years in the White House have overshadowed an entire lifetime of service? What if the man remembered for the Great Depression was also one of the greatest humanitarians in American history? Today we're taking a closer look at Herbert Hoover. Not just the 31st president, but the person. A man whose presidency definitely deserves some criticism, but whose life was defined by hard work, service, and a desire to help others. This is the story of Herbert Hoover. Let's do this. Herbert Hoover was born in Iowa in 1874, but his childhood was far from easy. By the age of 9, he'd lost both of his parents and was forced to move west to Oregon to live with some relatives. Growing up under the guidance of his Uncle John, Hoover learned the values of discipline, hard work, and personal responsibility. These early hardships shaped the way he viewed the world. Nobody ever handed Hoover success. If he wanted something, he believed he had to earn it. He had to work for it. That mindset would follow him for the rest of his life. And when a new university called Stanford opened up its doors in California, Hoover saw an opportunity, but he was gonna have to earn it. Hoover worked tirelessly to find his place at this new college. At Stanford, he studied geology and became a member of the university's very first graduating class. While at Stanford, Hoover met a geology student named Lou Henry. She was not only the first female geology major at the university, but she also had the same dedication and ambition that Hoover had. The two quickly connected, eventually marrying and becoming a partnership that would last the rest of their lives. After graduation, Hoover launched a career as a mining engineer. A mining engineer is a person who goes all around the world to find places for companies to mine for resources. His work took him all around the world, from Australia to China and across Europe. He became known for solving difficult problems and building considerable wealth through his expertise and his work ethic. Hoover's success was not built like many of the successful men of his era. Hoover's rise wasn't built on his political connections or his family influence. He built his success from the ground up. During World War I, thousands of Americans found themselves stranded overseas. Hoover stepped forward and organized efforts to bring them home. It was an enormous challenge, but he handled it with remarkable efficiency. That money that he had made being this big mining engineer was coming in handy. For the first time, the entire world got a glimpse of Hoover's ability to organize people, resources, and large-scale operations. But soon, when people saw what this guy can do, his responsibilities grew even larger. As war devastated Europe, millions of civilians faced starvation. Hoover became the head of relief efforts that delivered food to starving people in Belgium and other parts of Europe. At a time when entire communities struggled to find their next meal, Hoover coordinated one of the largest humanitarian operations the world had ever seen. Back home, Americans were encouraged to support this effort through voluntary conservation programs. Things such as Meatless Mondays or Wheatless Wednesdays became common practices as families would sacrifice small comforts to help those suffering overseas. And if Herbert Hoover can stop me from eating a hamburger on Monday just because it's Meatless Monday, he must be a pretty important guy. But through these simple programs, the results were extraordinary. Millions of people received food and aid through the programs that Hoover helped organize. Historians continue to debate the exact numbers, but there's no question that countless lives were saved because of Hoover's efforts. He wasn't doing this for political gain. He wasn't running for office. He simply believed that people who were starving deserved help. By the end of the war, Hoover had become one of the most respected men in the world. Some Americans even wanted him to run for president in 1920. Instead, Hoover entered public service as Secretary of Commerce under Warren Harding, and later, after Harding passed away in 1923, President Calvin Coolidge. In that role, he transformed what had once been a relatively quiet department in the government into one of the most active parts of the federal government. Hoover promoted efficiency. He encouraged new technologies. He improved industry standards. He was approaching problems the same way he had approached engineering his projects. He identified the issue, he organized his resources, and he found a solution. In the late 1920s, he looked like the perfect presidential candidate. And when Calvin Coolidge announced that he would not seek another term in 1928, Hoover became the Republican nominee for president. He entered the 1928 election with enormous popularity and a widespread public confidence. And I'll tell you, I'd have a widespread public confidence too if most of America saw me as sort of a hero during the First World War. Americans looked at his record and saw a man who had solved problem after problem. If he can feed millions, surely he can handle whatever challenges came with the presidency. So they voted him in. By a lot. In an electoral landslide, Herbert Hoover wins 444 votes to 87. He's pretty popular. He's pretty successful. I hope our new 31st president doesn't have some economic crisis that ruins his entire legacy. That would be terrible. Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". Franklin Roosevelt was the president for over 4,000 days. These are facts. But you know what else is a fact? The fact that Presidents Unplugged has an Instagram page. If you want presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at Presidents_Unplugged. That is Presidents_Unplugged. I'll see you there. Hoover's presidency started off great. But then came 1929, when the stock market crashed. What began with something called Black Thursday and Black Tuesday quickly spiraled into the worst economic crisis in American history. That success did not last very long. Banks failed, businesses shut their doors, investments disappeared, and unemployment reached almost 25%. 25%, 1 out of 4 Americans had no work. No president had ever faced anything like the Great Depression. But here's where the history gets a little foggy, because Hoover wasn't indifferent to the crisis. Despite what many people think, that Herbert Hoover just sat in his office, hands above his head, and just said, "Well, there's nothing I can do now." He actually attempted several ideas, including public works projects, cooperation with private businesses, and also something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided support to struggling financial institutions. The problem with Hoover's approach to the Great Depression was really the lens of his own life experiences. Hoover had grown up with almost nothing. He had built himself into a successful engineer out of nothing. He had earned his fortune through hard work and determination yet again from nothing. Because of that, Hoover believed that Americans could overcome their difficulties through working together, personal initiative, and determination. He feared that the federal government doing everything would create dependence and permanently expand government power, and it would take over the United States. When a guy is sitting in a big desk in a big building called the White House saying, "You should try harder, and maybe you'll succeed," this made sense to Hoover. It was how he had lived his life. But that perspective was not in the best interest for the American people. When bread lines grew longer, which is a line waiting for food, when families struggled to survive. Across the country, makeshift communities built by newly homeless Americans became known as Hoovervilles, a jab at the unsuccessful administration. But on Presidents Unplugged, looking at almost every president in American history, we have figured something out. The president is not fully at fault for the economic status of our country. We can blame Joe Biden or Jimmy Carter for inflation. We can blame Herbert Hoover for tariffs. We can blame Martin Van Buren for the Panic of 1837. Or can we? Fairly or unfairly, Hoover became the face of the crisis. And as public frustration grew, so did criticism of his administration. While Herbert Hoover didn't wake up every morning and say, "It's a new day to destroy the economic status of our country." While this is definitely an exaggeration, the thing that Hoover gets blamed for in the Great Depression story is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, to put it very simply, was Herbert Hoover saying, "Hey Americans, I really want you to buy American things, American crops, American products. If it's all American, we'll make all the money and we'll succeed. But to do that, I'm going to cut off trade with a bunch of other countries that give you things you use every single day." And I promise, the Americans were not mad in the 1930s that they couldn't get their Brazilian coffee shipped. They were mad Because why in the world would we focus on American products when all the Americans are not working, are waiting in breadlines, and have no motivation to do anything? It didn't make that much sense. And just like every other president over an economic depression, while they're not the main contributor, while they don't fully decide the economic state of the country, certain decisions can definitely push the nation in a good or a bad direction. And the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act most likely pushed us in a bad direction. And the American people were not happy, especially those who fought in World War I to keep our country prosperous and successful. Because in 1932, thousands of World War I veterans arrived in Washington, D.C., demanding the early bonuses they had been promised for their service. If you're a veteran, if you fight in a war, there's a chance that you get a bonus later in your life for fighting for the country. But normally it takes a little bit longer than 1 or 2 years to get those bonuses. These people who were waiting in bread lines, who had fought in World War I, said, yeah, we're not doing this. We want our money now. So what would make sense is that Hoover gives them their money and everyone's somewhat happy because they have a little bit more of a fatter wallet during the Depression. But instead of Hoover just giving them the money, he ordered the camps that they had set up cleared. And I'm not just talking about kindly telling them to leave. I'm talking about when Army Chief Douglas MacArthur carried out the operation using troops, cavalry, and tear gas. What? The people who fought for our country are being run out of the nation's capital with tear gas? What? These images shock the country. If we weren't blaming Herbert Hoover for causing some difficulties, we most definitely are now. For many Americans, it looked as though veterans who had served their nation were being pushed aside during one of the hardest moments in American history. The nation they fought for. It was a disaster and one of the defining controversies of Hoover's presidency. Man, Herbert Hoover, you have done a splendid job as president so far. Let's see what happens in 1932 for your re-election bid. By Election Day in November of 1932, Americans were ready for a different approach. They weren't ready for a president that pats him on the back and says, I did it once, you got this, dude. They wanted government intervention. And when Franklin Roosevelt promised a New Deal and a more active federal government, Hoover didn't stand a chance. Hoover had warned that such programs, expanding the government power too far, risked changing the relationship between citizens and their government. Or instead of citizens working hard to make money and to succeed in life, they'd be like, hey, government, please give me my check in the mail. I need this. And that is still debated today. Voters during the Depression disagreed with Hoover's take. And FDR won in a landslide, handing Hoover, a person who had won an electoral landslide 4 years before, one of the most decisive defeats in presidential history, with an even larger landslide destroying him in 1932. For many politicians, that would have been the end of their story. A difficult depression during a pretty awful presidency. It's just the end, I guess. But for Herbert Hoover, it wasn't. Even after leaving office, he continued serving the country that had handed him a very difficult 1932 election. he remained active in public life. Whether that was advising future presidents, continuing his humanitarian efforts, and later helping reorganize portions of the federal government through the Hoover Commissions under President Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. Isn't that crazy? That Hoover lived long enough to watch America emerge from the Great Depression, win World War II, enter the Cold War, and even witness the presidency and assassination of John F. Kennedy? Hoover truly lived an extensive life of service. And when Hoover died in 1964 at the age of 90, he'd spent several decades in service to causes larger than himself. And that brings us back to where we all started. Was Herbert Hoover a great president? Probably not. The Great Depression exposed flaws in his philosophy and produced decisions that historians still criticize today. His entire presidency was simply marked by the Great Depression. There was no other real time to prove himself. Political controversy, moments that deserve historical examination, were around every corner in Hoover's presidency. What could he have done without the Great Depression pulling him down? And that's where we get into the real lesson of Herbert Hoover. Was Herbert Hoover a great man of service? Absolutely. A small fraction of Hoover's life was spent in the White House, but the majority was spent helping others. He fed starving civilians across Europe during World War I. He organized humanitarian relief on a massive scale. He modernized the government, whether we're talking about his presidency or when he was Secretary of Commerce. He answered calls to serve whenever they came in. The world is a better place because of Herbert Hoover. And this is especially powerful in the world we live in today. The reason this episode is called Caught on Camera. Acts of charity, acts of service today are photographed, filmed, posted, and shared. Oh, look at what I did today, everybody. I fed the homeless. Look at what I'm doing. I'm volunteering in a soup kitchen. These aren't bad things. But making them all about yourself is. No viral videos showed Herbert Hoover getting caught on camera helping strangers. Hoover didn't do these things for people to look at him. He did these things because he believed they were the right thing to do. He fought for people who were hungry. He fought for people suffering through war. He fought for people who he had never met and would never meet. Whether those people lived in America or halfway across the world didn't seem to matter much to him. And that's why Herbert Hoover remains such an interesting figure in American history. His presidency will never escape the shadow of the Great Depression. And really, it shouldn't. His presidency was pretty much fully encapsulated by the event. But if we're going to judge a person's entire legacy, and not just a fraction of their life, we have to look beyond their worst chapter. Herbert Hoover may never rank among America's greatest presidents, but when it comes to humanitarian service, compassion, and dedication to helping others, few Americans left a larger impact on the world than he did. And that is why Herbert Hoover is so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about Chester Arthur. Imagine the president is assassinated, And the man who killed him declares, "Yes, now the vice president will become the president." What? The assassin supporting the vice president? Oh, that doesn't look good at all. This is the nightmare that Chester Arthur faced after James Garfield was assassinated in 1881. With a start to your presidency like that, Americans feared the worst. But would Chester Arthur become this corrupt politician everyone expected? Or would he surprise a skeptical nation by completely turning himself around? Learn about that and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. Thank you for listening to Presidents Unplugged. If you enjoy content like this, give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, when do we release new content? Once a month, maybe twice a year, maybe even once a year? No. We release new content every Friday at 1 p.m. for my American enthusiasts to enjoy. Come join me on our dive into making American history the most entertaining and interesting subject to learn every single week. I'm Ty Svensson, this is Presidents Unplugged, and I'll see you soon.